In this lesson, we'll discuss the process of archiving data. You'll find a completed version of this project in your Working Files directory. We need a way to store our application's data. We could potentially use a database or turn to Apple's more advanced persistence framework called Core Data, but this would probably be overkill for our application. We only have 2 entities and have pretty minimal data requirements. Instead, we'll simply write our data to a file. We could define a custom file format, but unfortunately that would require a fairly significant amount of work. Luckily, Apple provides an easy way to read and write objects to a file without going through the effort of creating a custom file format, and this ability is called archiving. The Foundation framework defines 2 key classes to support our needs: NSKeyed Archiver and NSKeyed Unarchiver. NSKeyed Archiver allows us to take an in-memory graph of objects and write them to the file system in a serialized form. And then NSKeyed Unarchiver is then used to rehydrate that graph of objects and load them back into memory. So let's see how this process works. Let me first run this app just so you can get a sense for what we're working with. So I simply have a UI with 2 buttons, a write data and a read data. Currently I just have these methods stubbed out and are just printing out a logging message to the console. But I'll quit the simulator. I first need to define a file URL, and this is the file system location where we'll read and write our data. And this is going to be located within the application's documents directory. So I'll create an NS array, and I'll call this URLs. And I'm going to use this class called NS File Manager, which will provide me some functionality to read and write from the file system. And I'll call its URLs for directory in domains method. And I'll pass in NS Documents directory. And the domain will be NS User Domain Mask. So this just finds the documents directory in my home directory for this app. Now, despite the fact that it returns an array of URLs, there's only going to be a single value in this array. So I'm going to type self.fileURL, and I'll initialize this file URL property I have. And I'll just call URLs last object. And I'll call URL by appending path component. So I'll call this file imusic.data. And this is the location where the data will be written to and read from. Now let me go down and focus on the write archive data method. I'm going to create an NS mutable array. And I'll just call this items. I'm going to create an instance of NS data. Call this file data. I'm going to use the class NSKeyed Archiver. And I'm going to say archived data with root object. And I'll pass in that collection of items. And I'll say file data, write to URL, and I'm going to pass in that file URL we defined above, and say atomically yes. So I want to make sure the entire file is written, or the entire thing's rolled back if it couldn't write it for some reason. So I've created an array, and I'm archiving that array to the file system. Now we currently don't have any items in here, so let's populate this with some values. So I can say items, add object, I'll just add a string value, and I can add other object types as well. So I'll add a NS date and add a NS number. Now let me run this. I'll click the Write Data button. Now let's go to our file system. Under Library, Application Support, iPhone Simulator, if I look through the contents of this directory, I'll see the iPhone Simulator's file system. So I can go under its Documents directory, and there's our iMusic data. Let me right-click on this and just open this with a text editor. So we can see this is a binary file format, just we're seeing gibberish here essentially. But this is the archived version of our NS mutable array. So how do we read that data back in? So I'll create an NS data. And pass in that file URL location. Create an NSMutable array of items. I'm going to call the NSKeyed unarchiver. And I'll say unarchive object with data. So pass in my data reference. And let's just simply log that to the console for right now. Okay, so I'll rerun the app. So I've written the data previously. Let me see if I can read it. And there we go. So there's the contents of our file. We've got our hello string, the date object, and the floating point number value. So that works really well for Apple's built-in data types. Let's try to add in an instance of our custom classes. So I've got both the artist and album classes imported. Let me just create an instance of album. And I'll just give this album an ID. I'll set its name to Rubber Soul. And then let's add that into our items collection. And just so that we know we've cleaned out the data, let's actually delete this file. And run the app. And our application crashed. So we've got a problem. Let's see what this says. It says unrecognized selector sent to instance. And we can see that it's terminating the app due to an uncaught exception, NS invalid argument exception. The specific reason is album encode with coder was called, but we don't have that method on that object. So as it turns out, we've got some additional work we need to do before we can archive our custom objects. But you now know how keyed archiving works. The two archiving classes, NSKeyed Archiver and NSKeyed Unarchiver, provide a convenient way to read and write object graphs to and from the file system. We can see we've still got some additional work to do to be able to serialize our custom objects, and in the next couple lessons we'll look at how to do that.